The first snowfall of December always reminded Sofia Martinez of the night her life changed forever. But this year felt different as she stood at the kitchen window of her small cottage in Burlington, Vermont. The flakes caught the streetlight, like tiny diamonds, and for once the memory didn't bring the familiar stab of guilt and shame. Instead, she felt something she'd thought was lost to her forever: peace. Her phone buzzed on the counter with another notification from the Facebook group, Concerned Citizens of Millbrook, the online gathering place where former neighbors from her old Connecticut town continued to dissect her actions from 3 years ago. Sofia didn't need to read the latest comments to know what they said. The story never changed. She was the homewrecker, the other woman, the destroyer of an innocent family. What they didn't know, what she'd never told anyone except her therapist and one investigative journalist who'd believed her story, was that by the time she'd entered David Brennan's life, there was nothing left to destroy. Sofia's doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Through the peephole, she saw a young woman with curly red hair holding a manila envelope, her breath visible in the cold Vermont air. "Ms. Martinez, I'm Rachel Kim from the Hartford Courant. Could I speak with you for a few minutes?" Sofia's stomach dropped. After 3 years of silence, she'd hoped the media attention was finally over. "I don't give interviews anymore. I understand, and I'm sorry to bother you. But something's happened in Millbrook, something that changes everything about your story." Against her better judgment, Sofia opened the door. Rachel Kim looked to be in her late 20s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of determined expression Sofia recognized from her own days as a social worker. "What kind of something?" Sofia asked, not inviting Rachel inside. "David Brennan was arrested yesterday. Multiple charges including embezzlement, fraud, and—" Rachel paused, checking her notes. "Sexual assault of a minor." Sofia felt the world tilt slightly. Sexual assault? A 15-year-old girl came forward, someone who was in his youth mentorship program at the church. Her parents finally convinced her to go to the police after they found text messages on her phone. Sofia gripped the doorframe, her mind racing back to the conversations she'd had with David 3 years ago, the ones that had made her increasingly uncomfortable before everything exploded. "Ms. Martinez, I know this is difficult, but I've been investigating David Brennan for months. I think you might have information that could help other victims come forward. I don't talk about what happened anymore. I understand you've been through hell. The whole town turned against you. But what if I told you that you might not have been the only woman? What if David Brennan's pattern of behavior goes back much further than anyone realized?" Sofia stared at Rachel for a long moment, thinking about the teenage girl who'd been brave enough to speak up, thinking about all the times she'd wondered if she should have said more 3 years ago. "Come in," she said finally. "But I'm making tea and you're going to let me tell this story my way." As they settled in Sofia's small living room, surrounded by the plants and books that had become her solace during her exile from Connecticut, Sofia began to speak about things she'd kept buried for 3 years. "I need you to understand something first," she told Rachel. "When I met David Brennan, I thought I was meeting a grieving widower who needed help with his children. I was their social worker, assigned to help the family adjust after Susan's death from cancer. I never intended to become involved with him romantically." "Tell me about that first meeting." Sofia closed her eyes, remembering that gray March morning when she'd first walked up to the pristine colonial house on Maple Street in Millbrook. The lawn was perfectly maintained, the shutters freshly painted, everything that suggested a family, holding itself together in the face of tragedy. David answered the door looking like he'd stepped out of a magazine. Even in grief, he was magnetic, tall, handsome, articulate. He spoke about Susan with such apparent devotion, about how hard it was to raise Emma and Jack alone, about wanting to do right by them. How old were the children? Emma was 14, Jack was 11. They seemed well cared for on the surface, but there were things that bothered me from the beginning. Sofia told Rachel about the subtle signs she'd noticed during her initial assessment visits. Emma was quiet to the point of being withdrawn, flinching when her father touched her shoulder or corrected her behavior. Jack was hypervigilant, constantly watching his father's face for approval or signs of anger. I thought it was grief, Sophia admitted. I thought they were all just struggling to adjust to life without Susan. David explained that the children had been very close to their mother and were having trouble accepting her death. But something made you question that explanation? The house. Everything in it had been completely redecorated. New furniture, new colors, new artwork. When I asked David about it, he said he couldn't bear to live surrounded by reminders of Susan. But Emma let something slip during one of our sessions. Sophia remembered the moment clearly. She'd been working with Emma on expressing her feelings about her mother's death, when the girl had mentioned missing her mother's paintings. I asked Emma if she'd like to hang some of her mother's artwork in her room, and she got this strange look on her face. She said there weren't any paintings anymore, that Daddy had gotten rid of everything the week after the funeral. Not donated, not stored, thrown away. That struck you as unusual? More than unusual. In my experience, grieving families hold on to mementos, especially when children are involved. To throw away everything within a week suggested something else entirely. Sophia explained how she'd begun to pay closer attention during her visits, noticing details that hadn't registered initially. The children had no photos of their mother displayed in their rooms. There were no books, clothes, or personal items that had belonged to Susan. It was as if she'd been systematically erased from the house. I started asking gentle questions about Susan, about their life before she got sick. That's when David began courting me, I guess you'd call it. How so? He started calling me outside of our scheduled appointments, asking for advice about the children, but gradually shifting to more personal topics. He'd mention how lonely he was, how hard it was to make decisions without a partner, how much he appreciated having someone who understood the situation. Sophia told Rachel about the evening David had called her at home, supposedly in crisis because Emma had been caught lying about her homework. When Sophia arrived at the house, the children were already in bed, and David had wine opened and dinner waiting. He said he hadn't eaten all day, that he was too worried about Emma to take care of himself. It seemed like a caring father reaching out for support, so I stayed. But looking back, it felt orchestrated. Did you become romantically involved that night? No, but the boundaries started blurring. David was skillful at making me feel like I was the only person who understood his situation, the only one who could help his family heal. He talked about Susan's illness, about how she'd become distant and cold during her treatment, about how he'd essentially been a single parent for months before she died. Sophia paused, remembering how convincing David had been, how he'd painted himself as a devoted husband who'd sacrificed everything for a wife who'd withdrawn from him emotionally. I started having feelings for him, she admitted. He was charming, intelligent, seemed completely devoted to his children. And I was going through my own difficult time. I'd recently divorced my ex-husband after discovering his gambling addiction. David made me feel valued and needed in a way I hadn't experienced in years. When did the relationship become physical? About 6 weeks into my involvement with the family. David had asked me to help with Emma's birthday party. Susan's birthday had been the week before, and Emma was having a particularly hard time. After the party, after the children were in bed, David broke down crying, talking about how much he missed having a partner, how grateful he was for my support. Sophia told Rachel about that night, how David had kissed her and how she'd responded, caught up in the emotion of the moment and her growing feelings for him. I knew it was inappropriate. I should have immediately requested a transfer to another social worker, but David convinced me that the children needed consistency, that they'd finally started opening up to me. He said we could keep our relationship separate from my professional duties. How did the children react to your relationship with their father? That's what should have been my first real warning sign. Emma shut down completely. She went from making progress in our sessions to refusing to speak to me at all. Jack became even more anxious, constantly asking when I was leaving, when things would go back to normal. Sophia explained how David had dismissed the children's reactions, saying they were acting out because they felt guilty about accepting someone new in their mother's place. He said Susan had made him promise to find someone who would love the children as much as she had. He showed me a letter he claimed Susan had written before she died, giving him permission to move on, encouraging him to find happiness again. Did you believe him? I wanted to believe him. The letter was in handwriting I assumed was Susan's. I'd never seen her writing to compare it to. And David was so convincing about Susan's final wishes, about how she'd worried about leaving him alone with the children. The relationship had progressed quickly after that. Within 3 months, Sophia was spending most weekends at the house, and David had started talking about marriage and her moving in permanently. That's when I started noticing things that didn't add up, Sophia told Rachel. David had very specific rules about what the children could and couldn't do, what they could talk about, where they could go. He monitored Emma's phone constantly, controlled her social media accounts, didn't allow her to have friends over. Did you challenge him about these restrictions? When I tried to discuss it with him, David always had reasonable explanations. Emma was at a difficult age and needed structure. She'd been acting out since Susan's death and couldn't be trusted with typical teenage freedoms. He said Susan had been too permissive and that he was trying to provide the discipline she'd lacked. But Sophia had begun to notice other troubling patterns. David would become angry if Emma wore certain clothes or hairstyles, saying they made her look too adult or inappropriate. He insisted on being present during Sophia's individual therapy sessions with Emma, claiming he needed to understand what his daughter was going through. The breaking point came when I found Emma's diary. Sophia told Rachel about the afternoon she'd been cleaning Emma's room, something David had asked her to do as part of helping the family establish new routines, when she'd discovered a notebook hidden under Emma's mattress. Emma had been writing about her mother's death, but not in the way I expected. She wrote about being relieved that her mother was finally free from Daddy's anger. She wrote about how her mother had tried to tell people that David was hurting her, but no one believed her because he was so good at acting normal in public. What kind of hurt was Emma describing? Physical abuse, emotional manipulation, financial control? According to Emma's diary, Susan had tried to leave David multiple times during her illness, but he'd convinced her doctors and family members that the chemotherapy was making her paranoid and confused. Sophia's voice grew quiet as she remembered, reading Emma's childish handwriting describing things no 14-year-old should have to witness. Emma wrote about David telling Susan that if she left him, he'd make sure she never saw the children again. He'd convinced everyone that Susan's illness was making her unstable, that she was having delusions about their marriage. Did Emma write about David abusing her directly? Not in explicit terms, but there were references to Daddy's special attention and the things I'm not supposed to tell anyone. She wrote about being afraid to be alone with him, about missing her mother because Mommy used to protect me from Daddy's games. Sophia had confronted David that evening after the children were in bed, showing him Emma's diary and demanding an explanation. He was furious that I'd invaded Emma's privacy, but also completely calm in this terrifying way. He explained that Emma had always been a troubled child, that she'd been jealous of her parents' relationship and had made up stories about him to get attention. Did you believe him? I wanted to, but I also couldn't ignore what I'd read. I told David I thought Emma needed to see a different therapist, someone with no connection to our relationship. That's when his mask completely slipped. David had become enraged, accusing Sophia of trying to destroy his family, of being jealous of his relationship with his children, of wanting to replace Susan so completely that she'd turn the children against him. He said things about Susan that made my blood run cold, called her manipulative, said she'd tried to poison the children against him before she died, claimed she'd been an unfit mother who'd neglected the children in favor of her art. Her art? Susan had been a painter. David had told me she'd given it up when the children were born, that she'd been too busy with family life to pursue her passion. But when he was angry, he let slip that he'd made her stop painting, that he'd thought it was a waste of time and money. Sophia told Rachel about the argument that had followed, how David had systematically torn down every positive thing he'd ever said about Susan, revealing a man who'd controlled and isolated his wife long before her cancer diagnosis. I realized that the grief-stricken widower I'd fallen in love with was a complete fabrication. The real David was someone who'd psychologically tortured his dying wife and was now doing the same thing to his children. What did you do with this information? I should have reported it immediately. I should have called Child Protective Services, should have documented everything I'd observed. But I was terrified that David would find a way to discredit me, that my romantic involvement with him would undermine any allegations I made. Instead, Sophia had tried to extract herself from the relationship gradually, hoping to maintain her professional relationship with the family long enough to build a case for removing the children from David's custody. That was my biggest mistake. David was too smart to let me just walk away. He knew I'd seen too much, knew too much about the real dynamics in his household. What did he do? He destroyed me first, before I could expose him. David went to my supervisor and filed a complaint about my inappropriate relationship with him, claiming I'd pursued him romantically and compromised my professional judgment. Sophia's voice grew bitter as she described how skillfully David had manipulated the narrative. He portrayed himself as a vulnerable widower who'd been taken advantage of by an unethical social worker, someone who'd exploited his grief and his children's trauma for her own emotional needs. He presented evidence of our relationship, photos he'd taken of us together, copies of affectionate text messages I'd sent, records of the gifts I'd given the children, everything that proved we'd been romantically involved, but nothing that showed how he'd orchestrated the whole thing. Did you try to defend yourself? I tried to explain the circumstances, to describe what I'd discovered about David's treatment of his family. But I had no credible witnesses. Emma was too frightened to speak up, and Jack was too young to understand what was happening. My supervisor was more concerned about the liability issues than the allegations about David. Within a week, Sophia had been suspended from her job pending an investigation. David had also filed complaints with the state licensing board and had threatened to sue both Sophia and her agency for emotional damages. The investigation was a joke. They were so focused on my ethical violations that they never seriously examined my concerns about the children's welfare. David was convincing, sympathetic, and completely credible. I was the disgraced social worker who'd crossed professional boundaries and was now making desperate accusations to save my career. What happened to Emma and Jack? David moved them out of state within 2 months. He claimed he wanted a fresh start away from the painful memories of Connecticut. By the time my investigation was complete and I was officially terminated, the children were gone. Sophia told Rachel about the aftermath, how the story had spread through their small town, how David had made sure everyone knew that their family social worker had seduced him and then tried to destroy his reputation when the relationship ended. The local newspaper picked up the story. Social worker fired for inappropriate relationship with widowed client. That was the headline. David gave interviews about how betrayed he felt, how I'd taken advantage of his vulnerability during the worst time in his life. Did anyone believe your side of the story? A few people, but they were afraid to speak up publicly. Susan had had some close friends who'd always been suspicious of David, who'd noticed how isolated she'd become during her marriage. But David had spent years discrediting Susan's concerns, painting her as unstable and paranoid. Sophia had lost her job, her professional license, and her reputation. She'd been unable to find work in social services anywhere in Connecticut, and the story had followed her to other states when she'd tried to start over. I moved to Vermont 3 years ago and took a job at a domestic violence shelter. It's the only social services work I can get now, and only because the director here understands what it's like to be disbelieved when you try to expose abuse. But now David's been arrested. How does that make you feel? Sophia was quiet for a long moment, processing emotions she'd kept buried for years. Vindicated, but also heartbroken. I keep thinking about that 15-year-old girl, about Emma, about how many other children might have been hurt because I couldn't find a way to stop David 3 years ago. You were in an impossible situation. David was a master manipulator who'd been perfecting his techniques for years. Maybe, but I was a trained social worker. I should have been better at recognizing the signs, better at protecting those children. Rachel pulled out a folder from her bag. Ms. Martinez, I've been investigating David Brennan for 8 months. What I've discovered suggests that you weren't the first person he'd manipulated and discredited. She showed Sophia documents revealing a pattern of behavior that went back more than a decade. Before Susan, David had been married to another woman, Patricia, who died in a car accident under suspicious circumstances. Patricia had also been isolated from her family, had also tried to leave David, had also been painted as unstable by her husband. Patricia's sister never believed the official story about the accident. She hired a private investigator who found evidence that David had been controlling Patricia's medication, that he'd likely drugged her the night she crashed her car. Why wasn't this information available when I was dealing with him? Because David was careful to move frequently, to reinvent himself in new communities where no one knew his history. He'd been living in Connecticut for less than 2 years when Susan was diagnosed with cancer. Rachel showed Sophia more documents, reports from other social workers, teachers, and counselors who'd had concerns about David's family over the years, but who'd been discredited or intimidated into silence when they'd tried to intervene. There were at least 3 other women who'd tried to help David's children or expose his abuse. All of them had their careers destroyed, their reputations ruined. David's pattern was to seduce women in positions of authority or trust, then destroy them if they became a threat. What about Emma and Jack? Where are they now? Emma's 18 now. She's the one who finally came forward about David, who encouraged the 15-year-old victim to go to the police. She's been living with Susan's sister in Oregon since she turned 18 and could legally leave David's custody. Rachel showed Sophia a letter that Emma had written to the Hartford Courant, explaining why she'd finally decided to speak out about her father. She mentions you specifically, Ms. Martinez. She says you were the only adult who ever tried to protect her from her father, and that she's carried guilt for years about not being brave enough to support you when you tried to expose the truth. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face as she read Emma's letter, which described the years of abuse she'd endured after Sophia's removal from their lives. The way David had used Sophia's downfall as proof of what happened to people who made up stories about him. Emma wants to speak with you, Rachel said gently. She wants to apologize for not supporting you 3 years ago, and she wants to help set the record straight about what really happened. And Jack? Still living with David when he was arrested, but he's been placed with Susan's family as well. Emma says he's struggling but getting therapy. She thinks he'll be able to testify against David eventually. Rachel explained that the investigation into David had expanded far beyond the initial sexual assault charges. Police had found evidence of financial fraud, tax evasion, and insurance fraud related to both Susan's and Patricia's deaths. They were also investigating whether David had hastened Susan's death by tampering with her medications. The prosecutor wants to interview you about your experiences with David and the children. Your testimony could be crucial in establishing his pattern of manipulation and abuse. Sophia felt overwhelmed by the prospect of revisiting that painful period, but also hopeful that her experience might finally serve some purpose. Will testifying help Emma and Jack? It could help them get justice, and it could prevent David from hurting other children. But I won't lie to you. It will also mean reliving everything that happened, facing public scrutiny again. Sophia looked out her window at the snow, thinking about the 15-year-old girl who'd been brave enough to speak up, about Emma's courage in coming forward after years of silence. 3 years ago, people said I destroyed an innocent family. Maybe it's time for them to learn that the family was already destroyed long before I arrived. 6 months later, Sophia found herself sitting in a Connecticut courtroom for the first time since her professional hearing 3 years earlier. This time, she was there as a witness for the prosecution in the case against David Brennan, who faced multiple charges including rape, child sexual abuse, domestic violence, fraud, and 2 counts of murder in the deaths of his wives. Emma sat in the front row of the gallery, now a poised young woman who bore little resemblance to the frightened 14-year-old Sophia remembered. When their eyes met during a break in testimony, Emma smiled and mouthed, "Thank you," words that meant more to Sophia than any professional recognition she'd ever received. The trial lasted 3 weeks and revealed the full scope of David's crimes. Testimony from multiple witnesses painted a picture of a man who'd systematically abused his wives and children while maintaining a facade of respectability that had fooled an entire community. Sophia's testimony was crucial in establishing David's pattern of manipulating authority figures and discrediting anyone who threatened to expose him. She described her experiences with the family, her growing concerns about the children's welfare, and the way David had destroyed her career when she'd gotten too close to the truth. David Brennan didn't just abuse his wives and children, Sophia told the court. He abused the entire system designed to protect families. He manipulated social workers, therapists, teachers, and community members into becoming unwitting accomplices in his crimes. The defense tried to portray Sophia as a vindictive ex-lover seeking revenge, but the weight of evidence against David was overwhelming. Patricia's sister testified about the suspicious circumstances surrounding her death. Susan's medical records showed signs of medication tampering. Multiple children came forward with accounts of David's inappropriate behavior during his time as a church youth mentor. Most powerfully, Emma testified about the years of abuse she'd endured, describing how her father had used Sophia's downfall as a threat against anyone who might try to help her. He told me that what happened to Ms. Martinez was proof that no one would believe me if I told them what he was doing, Emma said through tears. He said adults who tried to interfere with our family would be destroyed, just like she was. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. David was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As Sophia left the courthouse after the sentencing, she was approached by several reporters wanting her reaction to David's conviction. 3 years ago, this community decided that I was the villain in this story, she told them. They said I destroyed an innocent family for my own selfish reasons. I hope now they understand that the family was already destroyed by a man who spent years abusing his wives and children while hiding behind a mask of respectability. Do you feel vindicated by today's verdict? One reporter asked. I feel sad, Sophia replied honestly. Sad for all the children who were hurt because David was so skilled at manipulating the system. Sad for the time that was lost, the trauma that could have been prevented if people had been willing to look beyond David's public persona. What's next for you? I'm going back to Vermont, back to my work with domestic violence survivors. This experience has reminded me why that work matters, because there are David Brennans everywhere, and there are always people willing to believe them over their victims. A year after David's conviction, Sophia received a letter from the Connecticut Department of Children and Families, offering to restore her social work license and apologizing for the way her case had been handled. The letter acknowledged that the department's investigation had been inadequate and had failed to protect the children Sophia had tried to help. Sophia declined the offer. Her work in Vermont was meaningful and challenging, and she'd found peace, her new life. But she did frame the letter and hang it in her office as a reminder that sometimes justice comes slowly, but it does come. She also kept in touch with Emma, who was thriving in college and studying social work herself. During one of their phone calls, Emma asked Sophia why she'd been willing to sacrifice her career to try to protect children who weren't even her own. Because someone had to, Sophia replied. Your father was counting on people looking the other way, on adults being too concerned about their own comfort to risk confronting him. Sometimes doing the right thing costs everything, but the cost of not doing it is always higher. Do you regret what happened? The way everything turned out? Sophia thought about the question seriously, considering all the pain and loss of the past few years, but also thinking about the children who were now safe, the community that had finally learned the truth, the other victims who'd found the courage to speak up. I regret that it took so long for people to believe the truth, she said. I regret that children were hurt, while adults worried more about maintaining comfortable illusions than protecting vulnerable people. But do I regret trying to stop your father? Never. Even though it destroyed your reputation? Emma, my reputation was built on the belief that I was a competent professional who put children's safety first. When I tried to protect you and your brother, I was living up to that reputation, not destroying it. The people who said I destroyed your family were wrong about a lot of things, but they were especially wrong about what really matters. As Sophia ended the call and returned to her work with domestic violence survivors, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought her to this point. She'd lost everything she thought mattered, her career, her reputation, her place in the community. But she'd gained something more valuable, the knowledge that when it truly mattered, she'd chosen protection over self-preservation, truth over comfort, justice over reputation. The people who'd said she destroyed a family had been right about one thing. She had been instrumental in breaking apart the Brennan family. But what they'd failed to understand was that some families need to be broken apart, that sometimes destruction is the only path to healing, and sometimes the people brave enough to wield the hammer are the true heroes of the story. 1. Brennan had already destroyed his family long before Sophia arrived. She'd simply been the one with the courage to acknowledge that destruction and try to save the children from the wreckage. And in the end, that courage had made all the difference.